Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Madventions Innovation Lectures. I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker tonight, Marianne Patelki, who will be discussing quality management systems and the essential role they play in ensuring regulatory and corporate compliance and streamlining the medical device innovation and commercialization process. Marianne has always been interested in health science and received her Bachelor of Science degree from the University of British Columbia. She's been working in the healthcare industry for the past 30 years. Her experience includes a wide range of product types from medical devices, biopharmaceuticals, small molecule drugs to active pharmaceutical ingredients. She's been employed in the departments of research and development, quality control, quality assurance, and manufacturing in the capacity of supervisor, manager, and director positions. She's presented courses and seminars as a part-time faculty member at Humber College School of Health Sciences and the University of Toronto Professional Development Center and for the Pharmaceutical Science Group. As a corporate director of Patelki and Associates, she consults in a wide range of healthcare sectors, including pharmaceuticals, biopharmaceuticals, and medical devices. Her extensive experience and knowledge in quality systems assists both multinational and innovative startup companies. Marianne is also a member of the Scientific Expert Committee in Health Canada and a longstanding member of the American Society of Quality and the Pharmaceutical Sciences Group. Marianne, thank you very much for being our guest speaker tonight.
Thank you. So thank you for that introduction. My name is Marianne Patelki, as already been discussed. This presentation is called Designing in Quality, and the actual reason that I called it this is that a lot of times when we're designing products, we're designing that quality into those products. We're just not documenting them, or we're not doing it through the regulatory channels that they would like to see, when you're trying to sell this product or when you're trying to actually submit it for a regulatory approval. So as I said, designing in quality, and sorry, I'm just going to take, nope, that's not working. That's not working.
Oh, it should be the right arrow there. Nope.
Nope. Okay.
Try here.
Sorry. I'm terrible with technology.
Oh. Must have just gone to sleep. I think we're okay now.
We're good now?
Let me just, yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what I want to talk about is, frankly, what is quality? Because that seems to be a difference of opinion in a lot of companies and quality systems. And then we're going to talk about both quality and what a quality management system is. And then going forward, to create that quality, we are going to use these three tools as we invent, as well as R&D, go into production of medical devices. So we're going to talk about design control, and I'm only going to talk about design control from the innovation or the conception of that design control right through to the completion of R&D. So once you finish your prototype and you're ready to go into production, I kind of stop there because I could go on design control for weeks. And we're just going to do the kind of the quick area of where design control will impact your product, as well as how we integrate that risk management tool into the design of the product to ensure that we have looked at all the quality parameters of that actual medical device. And then we're going to talk about the last thing, which frankly everybody hates, is the documentation in the records. All right, and I'll talk to you about how important that is and some of the pitfalls that I see when I work with companies, both small companies that are starting up, virtual companies, as well as kind of the big multinationals where we fall into problems with documents and records. So first of all, what is quality? Well, these are the definitions out of the Merriam-Webster. A peculiar essential character, inherent feature. The last two is what we're trying to achieve. The degree of excellence and the superiority in kind of that actual device and taking that from that definition of quality through the quality system. Okay, so quality from a regulatory term is documents which specify the quality elements and the framework required for design and production. So we see the regulations start off with production. So in 76, and I'm going to talk about the US regulations because those are the most common we see. Most companies want to break into the US market rather than the Canadian market. But we see those coming in for the production side in about 1976. So we get defined the medical device, what we call the QSRs, and then we are pushed back by the regulator into the design phase in about 1998, anywhere between 96 and 98. We're now pushed back into that the regulations for quality go back into the design phase. In the last, I'd say 10 years, we're being pushed back into the research phase. So basically they're starting to ask us for quality parameters, quality elements right from the conception of that medical device and starting to put those parameters down. And we'll talk about what parameters we're looking at in quality. So we're getting pushed back both by the regulator, by kind of the corporate culture, the business aspect, and then actually as you try to sell this product or get actual funding, they're pushing us back to research. How did you come up with this? What parameters did you look at? So from a regulatory term, I used Canada, US, and EU. There are other regulations for other regulatory bodies, but those are pretty much the common three we see. So in Canada, for medical devices, we use ISO 13485 for all medical devices class 2 and greater. In the US, they have asked, well, they're part of ISO 13485 committee, but have chosen to write their own regulations. So we see something called 21 CFR 820, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. It's for the class 2 and 3, 2, 3, and 4, and select classes of 1. CFR means the Code of Federal Regulations, and the healthcare industry, it's all about acronyms. So there's a lot of acronyms. If you just want to know what those acronyms, let me know. In the EU, they use 13485 as a voluntary standard. Now, the thing with all three of these different regulations is they basically contain all the same elements, just written slightly differently, or there's slightly different focus on one of those elements over the other. But all of them contain exactly the same elements. So from a quality management system, the definition is the separate processes that are used to design, build, conduct, and deliver products in accordance with company policy. QMS defines the policies, the procedures, and the responsibilities of the company. Basically, your quality management system tells pretty much the world how you define how quality is incorporated into your product, as well as this is your way of showing to the regulators that you understand those regulations, and then how you interpret those regulations to ensure the quality of the product. And then the purpose of the quality management system as a system in itself is to maintain the procedures that reflect to provide those products of assured quality. So basically, your quality management system is this all-encompassing both documents and records and everything that you achieve to try to ensure that quality's been built in to that medical device. So every time you make a decision, you will go back and say, okay, how has quality been designed into this decision and into this medical device? And we do that at every stage, right from conception right through to what we call cradle to grave. At all times, we're doing those kinds of questions, and we're doing those kinds of systems to ensure that our quality management system encompasses everything. So the life cycle of these products. So you have a conception, you have an idea that you then take that conception and move it into R&D. You do some research, you do some development, you do your prototypes, you may do alpha studies, beta studies, and then you're saying, okay, I've got it, let's put it into production. Now we're going to mass produce. And mass produce means anything from one device to thousands of devices. So you've taken it into production and you keep producing until you either no longer produce that medical device or change it to the point that it's no longer the initial medical device in its intended use. So we see this, what I call kind of cradle to grave stage, and at each stage of the life cycle of this medical device, the quality system elements will come in and be defined and then redefined through each stage. For example, a normal quality system that you would have is something called recalls. You're able to take, if there is a problem, that you're able to bring that medical device out of distribution or sale or out of a body because it's been implanted. Well, we don't do that at conception. That part of the quality system really doesn't enter until we get into late stage development and definitely into production. So as I said, these kind of quality management system elements come in and come out, get redefined as you go through. It's the same with things like complaints. Nobody complains when you're doing the innovations or the concept, right? There are no complaints. You haven't made anything yet. So again, that system is not integrated yet into your quality system until you get into things like design and development and definitely into production. What we do see at conception will be that design control element, and we will see that risk analysis element. We will also see the documentation element, and then the records element of that. So those three elements you will see throughout this life cycle, but it starts at conception. Okay, so I talked about those three elements. So design control, risk analysis, documentation, and records. And a lot of times in most companies, it just falls under documentation. Anything that is recorded, whether it be recorded on paper, whether it be recorded electronically, we call that a documentation system. And we'll talk about the differences between documentation and records further on. All right, so this is a long laundry list of what are the different elements of design control. We have something called design and a development plan, the organizational and technical interfaces, design input, design output, design review, verification, validation, transfer, and changes. I'm going to focus on kind of the top four because that's where the first elements of design control actually are incorporated into your medical device. From the conception, where we look at the design and development plan, then the organizational and technical interfaces. So very rarely is a medical device designed by one person, and it's taken by one person from the time of conception right to the time of production. It's a team. So you bring different team members in and out of this design of the medical device. And that's what we talk about when we talk about the organizational and the technical interfaces. You're going to tell me what experts you're going to be bringing in and out of that design phase during the R&D. That tells us whether or not you've brought in the right people. If you're getting to, for example, production, and I don't see any responsibilities from a regulatory standpoint, chances are that device will not meet the regulatory requirements. You need those experts to bring in that knowledge, just like you need the engineers to bring in the knowledge. So I kind of get to a design phase. I start looking at design controls or device master files or device history files or design history files, and I don't see any expertise in the science, or I don't see any expertise in the engineering. And that makes me nervous because it means that, again, you haven't taken those technical interfaces and incorporated them into your medical device. Then we talk about design input, which is all the elements, all the systems, all the questions you need to ask about making that medical device. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then the output. So I know what I want. I have a concept. I start to make my prototypes. What exactly did I get out of that? Did I make what I initially wanted to make? Is it the same medical device from conception right through to the output? And then what we do is we basically look at those two things, and that's what we do when we do design review. Okay, so did what we intended to do actually happen? Did what we intended the inputs to be actually are created in this medical device? And so I'm going to talk about a glove. This is a glove that's impregnated and antimicrobial. It's an antimicrobial glove. That's what I'm inventing. So that's my innovation. So the design plan starts with the who, what, when, where, why. Okay? So the question is, who is using the device? Is this a device intended for a patient at home? Is it intended for a doctor in a clinic? Is it intended for a nurse in a hospital? Is it intended for a surgeon during surgery? Is it intended for EMS? So the emergency services, while they're doing their calls, is this intended for a disaster? So, or an actual outbreak such as Ebola. So my first question is, who is this intended for? Based on that, I'm going to have criteria. So I'm already starting to design what this is for. I need to know what this is for because the patient glove will look very different than the surgeon's glove, which will look very different than the EMS glove, which will look very different than the disaster glove. They have different purposes and different intended uses and possible different outcomes. The next question is, what is the device for? So in a patient, am I protecting the patient or am I protecting someone else? Like usually when it's a glove for a patient, I'm protecting the patient, that different parts of their body. So I do not want the bacteria that is on their skin going into a wound they are actually dealing with at home. So this would be, the device is for the patient. What is it being used for? It's to stop hand bacteria or bacteria that's on the hand going into an open wound. If it's for a doctor, what is the device for? Is it to protect the doctor or protect the patient? And depending on what that answer is, that design of that glove will be different. Am I putting the antibiotic or the antimicrobial property on the outside of the glove, the inside of the glove? Is it throughout the glove? The next question is, where is the device being introduced? So this is when we talk about regulatory markets. Okay, so where am I going to do this? Am I doing this in North America? Am I doing this in Canada, the US, South America, Europe? Am I doing this in Africa? Does it matter? For example, disaster, where we have kind of world events. I don't know where it's going to happen. I don't know where the next Ebola is. I don't know when the next tragedy is going to happen, so I don't know what market it is. That makes a difference. That means I have to cover all markets. It means I don't have a specific market. I don't have a regulatory body that I can say, ah, yeah, I need it to meet the Canadian regs, or I need it to meet the US regs. I need it to, cover the global market. So where is this being introduced? When is the device being used? So my glove is when can it be used? If it's being used for the patient, do they use it all the time? Do they wear it all day? Do they wear it one-time use as they're changing their dressing? Same with the surgeon. Is this for a specific surgery? Is it for cardiac surgery? Is it for osteosurgery, EMS? What type of EMS are we talking about? Are we talking about a firefighter, a paramedic? So when is this device being used? Just as important as who is using it, because that's going to influence how you're going to develop and design this glove. And then why is it being used? This is more of a question where, for example, for IVDs. I have an IVD which its intended use is to look for a genetic marker. Okay, so I have an IVD that's going to be used to look for HIV genotyping. Okay, so I have a genetic kit that does, the actual kit itself tells me nothing except that my HIV genes are changing. But how does that help the patient? what that device is being used for is it's being used for to change the actual medication that that patient is taking. So the intended use of this device is to look for genetic mutations and the rates of those genetic mutations. Why is it being used? It's being used to change the actual medications so that I can keep up. So when I see a drug that's starting to fail, giving either a mutation rate which becomes a problem for the patient, I am going to change your cocktail of drugs. That in itself is a design and development plan. You have already started to define who, what, when, where, and now can start to design that quality system around it. These will change. I guarantee the design and development plan you started conception will have changed by the time you've gone to production or taken that medical device throughout its life cycle. We always see changes, and those changes are good, but we also have to know how those changes change all these questions. And that's where a lot of companies don't do that well, is they are so focused in going ahead, conceiving this, putting into production, that we lose the focus of what we actually intended to. So remember I talked about that input and what actually came out of it, okay, and the output. So that's the design and development plan, a very important tool and a very important way to start to define what you're doing. And along with that is this design control. It's a really busy slide, and I'm sorry, but it's the only kind of snapshot we have of the design control elements. So everything in yellow is everything you should be doing for your device at this stage, whether it be conception, whether it be a prototyping. You're going to look at the planning, you're going to ask those questions. You're going to continue to ask those questions every time you do the next step. You're going to talk about the inputs. The inputs are who's using it, what do they need, how are they using it. The outputs is how is that going to change my glove. I'm using a single-use glove that I'm going to wear all day. Chances are it's going to be of a higher tensile strength than something I'm putting on and off, okay? Because it's going to go through a lot more strain and stress if I'm wearing it all day than a single-time use. The problem is a single-time use for an EMS requires a much higher tensile strength because they've got seconds to put those gloves on. It's not a surgeon who's got the time to take a few minutes and unwrap everything, put it on so he's under good aseptic techniques than an EMS who's literally grabbing it and putting it on. They're tugging at it, they don't have time. That tensile strength on my input better match the output. Or what will happen is every time an EMS puts on the glove, it's gonna rip. It always, if you have cheap gloves, they rip at the cuff, right? You put it on and the cuff's gone. So that is an intended use that was not met. They did not look at how you're putting that glove on, how quickly, with what strength, and for how long, and therefore the tensile strength's not right, okay? So this is what we talk about when we talk about inputs and outputs. I'm talking about what that device is intended to do, and did you fulfill that requirement, okay? And then we continue to do this as verification. So every time we make the prototype and I send it out, I get people to use it and they give me feedback, whether it be an alpha, beta trial, whether it be prototypes. They're going to come back and say, yeah, 5 times out of 10, that glove ripped. Okay, I couldn't get it on, or it's taking me too long. Your instructions to put this on takes 5 minutes. I haven't got 5 minutes. An EMS person has seconds. A surgeon, maybe not. A patient, an at-home patient, kind of your worst nightmare, because they also don't have patience. They have a tendency not to be trained. They don't read instructions. And so you get a lot of wrong outputs. It didn't work. It ripped. It disintegrated. So you're looking at those inputs, what you intended to do versus what you actually get out of it. And then that verification. When we put all that together, we also do a review, because At some point, you're going to get the complaints. You're going to get the, if not complaints, you're going to get questions. Those should all be reviewed to say, okay, are we putting the right inputs in? Are we making this glove correctly for this intended use? And I may take that wonderful antimicrobial glove, and I may make it for multiple intended uses. I may make one for a surgeon. I may make another one for an EMS. I may make others for disasters. All those gloves all had inputs. All those gloves have outputs. And I pretty much guarantee you're not going to be making the same glove for all three of those uses. Because because a surgeon, when he wants a glove that he can feel, especially when they're doing surgery. They need to be able to have that tactile information as they're doing the surgery. So you're not doing a glove that's, 3 millimeters thick for an EMS guy who's basically got to strap it on and start. And he's, tearing it. There's a lot of wear and tear on that glove. You're going to be designing and inputting a glove that's very thin, that is strong, but very thin. Okay, so that's when we talk about inputs and outputs and verifications. So this is the beginning. So you do this this blue and this yellow now, and you will continue to do it. Every time you take a look at your device, create the prototype, start creating the production scale. And then at some point, you're going to say, yeah, we got it right. We've got the glove. We're going to go into production. That's when we do something called the transfer. So that's a very specific way of transferring my prototype and being able to give it to a production team. And you went from 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or maybe 1,000 gloves. Now you're going into 1,000,000 gloves. So we are now doing that transfer, making sure the inputs for the 1,000,000 is the same, and that the output for that 1,000,000, that every single one of those gloves is exactly the same as what we had in that prototype. Then we start the pilot production. So we do the initial transfer, and there's something called validation, which again is a system tool to ensure that you're making this time and time again, and it's meeting those outputs, that it's meeting the requirements every single time. And then you do your pilot production, and then you go into full production. All these documents, so these documents in yellow that we're starting to define are what we call the design, become part of the design history file. Okay, so you basically create a diary of your product. I'm going to call it a diary because basically you should write everything down. So the successes, the failures, the actual regulatory documentation. You want to talk about everything about that device, and we call it the design history file. So it's all the pertinent documentation around the planning, around the inputs, the outputs, the verification. And then you will make changes. So tell me what those changes are. Tell me why you made those changes. Are they because of failures? Are they because of complaints? Are they because it just doesn't work? So, because frankly, your failures will teach you a lot more than your successes. And so we want to see what those changes are and how they are documented and reviewed. So it's a pretty busy slide. And in there, if you see right on the very end, is that submission in that technical file. You are required by law for any regular body is to provide a design history file and to provide the documentation on all these control elements. Okay. The biggest thing I find is when I help companies do this, so they usually call me and say, can you help us write the part of this technical file that we need to file for the government so we can get this approved? And I say, great. So let's see the design history file. And it's this thick. Well, we have everything. We just didn't write it down. So it's usually the inventor has it all in his head. The engineers who prototyped it have everything in their head. And you're hoping, and I'm hoping as I'm standing there, that none of the engineers have left. Because chances are when they leave, they take that corporate information with them because they didn't write it down. I didn't get the design history file, which should be technically binders and binders of information. So who invented this? Who decided that this was a good idea? Well, he's left. Okay, so do we have any information on why he decided this was a good idea? What was the intended use? What did he hope to accomplish by creating this medical device? Well, we kind of know where, we're not really sure where he started. We don't know how he created it, but we do have it. Well, that's nice, but that's not good enough. We need to know all that background information, because that background information helps us understand that design, helps us understand the risk, and helps us understand the actual conception of this product. So that's the design. How do we get there? Well, we get there through risk analysis. Every time you design, and if you actually invent the medical device, you've done this. You've done this in your head. Hopefully you've done it on paper, but probably not. But you have done this in your head. You have looked at around you and said, we have a risk. We need to reduce this risk. So we're going to design this medical device to reduce this risk. Okay, so the risk analysis is basically a systematic use of the available information to identify the hazard and to estimate the risk. Okay, it sounds pretty easy, but a lot of companies and a lot of individuals have a problem doing this. They have it in their head. They have an inherent, yeah, I know this is a risky procedure. If we do this, we can reduce the risk. But I don't have anything tangible. They never wrote it down. They didn't tell me the incidence of an infection of the surgeon by a non-microbial glove. So we know it's the right thing to do, but we can't give you any tangible information about it. So this is what risk analysis is. It's basically to document and start you thinking and gathering information. If you don't, and we talk about available information. A lot of times we don't have the available information. So this makes us go out and get it. So we start to look through papers, through our own experience, through talking to the experts in the field. How often do you get an infection when you're doing this particular surgery? What type of infections do you get? Is my glove input correctly to prevent those infections? If my glove is for one type of infection and they're getting another type, then my input is wrong. It's the wrong input and it's the wrong output. And the risk assessments are performed at every stage of the development process. So my actual feedback for most companies is this doesn't happen until the regulator asks for it. And then we try to backfill it. And let me tell you, there is not a document that if you're going to backfill is not obviously you're backfilling. And that's a risk assessment. Because you have all the data? Really? You didn't have that data when you started the initial invention. You didn't have the information. So how come you have it now? It's very obviously you're backfilling this to actually do this as a regulatory requirement rather than a corporate requirement, or designing in that quality by doing the risk assessments. So a lot of times, like I said, we're backfilling. I come and say, okay, let's see the risk assessments. And this is an evolution, right? So I see the first one, which is really simple, not a lot of information, but you've started to give me the inputs and the outputs. And then kind of, a couple of months later, a year later, depending on the development of this product, could be 5 years later, you go back and look at, are your assumptions correct? If you said this was low risk, and I've seen in risk assessments where they say it's never happened. Well, never say never, because soon as it happens, your risk assessment is pretty much out the door, because your initial assessment, your initial assessment and analysis was incorrect. So now we have to go back and say, yeah, it did happen. That's fine, it did happen. Now, what did we do to change that input and the output of that particular device based on that? Okay, so that's what risk analysis is. And there's, of course, a regulation for this. We are regulated in this, if you haven't already seen. So we do a risk analysis to an ISO standard called 407.1. It's medical devices application of risk management to medical devices. So this is a framework of what your risk management process is going to look like. You're going to establish a framework. You're going to actually do the risk assessment and analysis. You're going to evaluate the risk that you got. You're going to decide if you have to control that risk. Is it an acceptable risk or not? And if it is, then we go forward, then the risk is acceptable. If it's not, if it's too high, then we do what we call risk mitigation. So we gotta change that glove. So if I've done a risk analysis and I found out that my glove is failing 30% of the time, so it's ripping or the patient is getting an infection, 30% of the time, is that too high for me? And if it is, what do I do? So how do I change that input to control that risk? I'll reevaluate it and control that risk. So if a surgeon's going in, he's got a really nice thin glove, loves the glove, but it rips on him every, 1 out of 1,000. He's 1,000 patients, and every time, because it's so thin. Okay, so my first thing is, okay, we have to make the glove a little stronger, a little thicker. The problem is, as I make it thicker, he's having problems doing the surgeries. So sometimes when you do risk mitigation, you actually have a higher risk. And so something else comes out of it. So that's why we go back and reevaluate it and then say, okay, did it work? No. The surgeon's not happy because he can't feel. So we go back and we start again and look at that risk analysis. And then we look at a risk acceptability, and then we review and we document. So while everybody does this, somehow we lose this. Number 9 pretty much never happens unless the regulator has asked you for it. Then all of a sudden we write it down. And then what happens from there, from that review and report, we provide product information. Okay, so now I may need special controls, I may need information, I may need training. And we do some kind of production information to either make the glove stronger, to let the surgeon know he's got to be careful so that this glove is not that strong. It will protect, but it is fragile because it gives you that ability. And sometimes that's all the surgeon needs. Okay, I've got to be careful with this. I got to watch how I pull on it. I've got to watch how it's used. If I pinch some kind of another medical device in it, what's going to happen? And then his mitigation. What's he going to do if his glove rips during surgery? So it gives him the heads up. Okay, do I double glove? Okay, so now I've lost that feel again. I double glove, it's just as bad as making too thick a glove. So his mitigation of, okay, if this glove rips during the surgery, what am I going to do? Okay, so that's kind of and now we're going to break it down. So establishing the framework is basically doing the rules. Give me the rules of the game. What game are we playing? Playing chess, electronic golf, or are we playing hockey? You're going to tell me what the game is. So you're establishing the framework. You're going to tell me how you're going to interpret that whole chain of events and how you're going to do it. So you define the process and you establish the roles and responsibilities. Risk analysis is never a single person. It's a team. And team members never agree. So you have to have ground rules. Okay? So what to me is 1 in 1,000 is low risk, could be high risk to someone else. If we all got on the highway on the 407, we all got into a car, and I told you we're going to start from the end to at the beginning in Hamilton and get to the very end, we will all arrive at a different time. I guarantee it. We all have a different risk tolerance of how fast we're going to go to get there. And frankly, if there's a reward at the end, I can push you to go a little faster because there's a reward in the end. So again, the roles, the responsibilities, and the ground rules. How much risk are we all collectively going to accept? The next thing is specify the intended use and the scope. So the biggest thing that happens with risk analysis when I sit down with companies to do risk analysis is it's just overwhelming. Oh my God, where do we start? Well, start small, start within a sandbox, and don't go out of the sandbox. And that's what starts to happen is people start to come out of the sandbox because they want to talk about something else, or they're bringing in something that's not really relevant. Start with the scope of the device. Is it for the patient? And is this risk analysis end user? If it's a device where there's an end user, there is someone who administers that device or works with that device, or is it the manufacturing person of that device? We do risk analysis to make sure we don't hurt our employees as we're making this device. So define that scope. Tell me when on this risk analysis, who are you trying to protect? And you may do 3 different ones. You may do a manufacturing one, you may do a user one, and you may do an end patient one, because that makes it easy. Okay, for the end patient, it's harm. For the manufacturing personnel, it's also harm, but that harm is created differently than what would happen at the end user level, okay? So define the scope of the device. Identify the hazards. So as I said, the potential sources of harm associated with that product at all levels. So that's what a lot of companies forget to do. It's all about, which is great, it's all about the end user, but what about the person administrating it? So for example, IVDs, the patient who is having the IVD, their blood, is actually the least harmed out of most of this, because the actual user, the technician in the lab who's doing the actual analysis is working with HIV blood. So chances are, if something goes wrong, they're going to be the most harmed, right? The patient has the mutations. Nothing's going to change based on that IVD. So it's the user, the actual user of that device that actually will have the most harm, and possibly the manufacturing personnel. So when we do standards, we're using standards of HIV, blood that has HIV mutations in it. So again, we're using blood. So I'm going to protect the person who's making that kit. So those risk analysis could be similar, but not quite, because they have a very small fraction. I've got, liters of this stuff that I am trying to aliquot in as my standard for that kit. So look at all levels, not just the end user. And then look at the severity of the harm, okay? So again, the more severe the harm, the higher I'm going to say, I don't want to take that risk. The harm to the user who's actually using my IVD is too high. I'm going to have to look at a different way. Can I then use standards that aren't actual blood types? Can I run some kind of actual electronic program so that when they are using the patient's blood, they already have all the mutations? So it's basically against a database. So they don't have to use a standard that has multiple mutations. So look at the severity of the harm. Define how the hazardous conditions can happen. So again, my glove. How can it rip? How can it fail? So how can it rip? It's being used outside of my parameters of how to actually put it on. Did I not put the antimicrobial agent in it? If I had an antimicrobial agent like silver, so if I had a silver impregnated glove, is it on the outside? Is it on the inside? Is it encompassed in the glove? What would happen if that silver actually leaches out? Leaches out to the patient, leaches out onto me as the user? So look at the hazardous conditions. So we kind of use those tools to figure out how can this fail? And we will spend weeks and months and years trying to figure this out. Tell me how it can fail, because what I actually thought it was being used for and what actually happens in the field are totally different things. So again, I'm looking at what hazardous conditions happen and how often does it happen? How often does that silver actually enter the patient by mistake because it's leaching off the actual glove? and it hasn't bound correctly. So we then define these hazardous conditions. And this is part of this analysis here. So part 2, 3, 4, this is where we're defining it. Okay, so what are the hazards? Then we estimate the risk. So this colorful little chart is we look at, okay, how likely is that harm? Very, you know, and we normally use numbers, but when we're starting out, we don't have numbers. We have nothing. We don't have any information. We're going to start to gather this information. So what are the likelihood that a glove will rip? Well, based on what we know about gloves, probably likely to very likely. So this particular glove we know rips a lot. Okay, so likely to very likely. So what is the harm? Is it the severity of the harm? Is it negligible or is it severe? And as you see by this pretty little colors, the green is low and the medium, the red is high, and somewhere in the middle is yellows, right? So again, the rules are how many of us would be okay with a medium to high severity? How many of us would be okay with a high severity? How many of us would be very likely but negligible harm, as opposed to unlikely but severe harm? So I'll ask a question, and I normally do this. What do you believe is the higher severity of harm? 300 people who die in a plane crash, 300 people who are going to die in the roads in the GTA in this weekend, or 300 people are going to die of cancer in the next 20 years. Chances are, if I polled all of you, 300 people dying in a plane crash at Pearson this afternoon is going to be, oh my God, unbelievable. But it's still 300 people. So when you take a look at severity of harm, make sure that you're all understanding what that harm is and that it's not a gut reaction, right? So 300 people are still dying, whether it be in a single event, whether it be over the weekend, or it be for 20 years, okay? So we all look at harm and the severity of harm differently. So again, those ground rules of, you know, doesn't make a difference. And then the probability. So if I said the probability of snow tomorrow is 30%. Okay, is it 30% of the day? Is it 30% of me standing here at Sunnybrook that it's gonna snow on me tomorrow? Or is it some other probability? Well, if you look at forecasting, it's a couple of probabilities. And the most important probability of whether it's going to snow is how the forecaster, how well he believes that event's going to happen. So he believes it's going to happen 100% tomorrow, but he doesn't know where. So it becomes a 30% probability. Or he knows all of the GTA is in this weather system, but he actually doesn't know if the snow is going to come. So that 30% is a probability of two different things. And the most important of it is how confident he is the snow is going to come. So when we look at probabilities, again, look at what that probability means to you and what it's telling you, because it can be deceiving. The sixth part of it, so this part here, is we've evaluated that risk, right? And we're in the medium to high. We have to make a decision. So our decision is, do we mitigate or do we go ahead and it's okay? We will accept that risk. And again, the difference between very likely but low to negligible versus very unlikely but severe. So the glove may only fail 1 in a million, but when it fails, both the patient and the user are going to die. Okay, so how do we require mitigation for that? And understanding that there's no such thing as zero risk. Things are going to fail. There is, you know, we have yet to make a device that has never failed. So we're always going to have a risk, but how comfortable are we going to be with that risk and its probability? So that's the evaluation of risk. Do we accept that risk or do we have to mitigate it? And then the control of risk. So reduce risk to acceptable levels. So this is what we call risk reduction. We're going to have to redo the inputs to get a better output. And are changes required? Yes or no? Yes, they are. Why are they required? Well, because we don't accept the risk. I don't accept 300 people dying at all, whether it be a plane crash over the weekend or in 20 years. I will not accept that risk. So I have to make changes. And then once we basically do this for every hazard, for every type of person or level or user, we then look at the overall risk. Is the overall risk acceptable? Do the benefits outweigh the potential risks? And that's what every regulator, every company looks at, is does this work? And will it outweigh the potential risk? And a lot of times we'll make changes, and guess what? They didn't work. They actually make it worse. And we didn't know that. Like, we did the risk analysis, we did the design control. We didn't foresee something happening. So if you're not a surgeon, thickening a glove to make it of a higher tensile strength makes a lot of sense to me. But I didn't have a surgeon who was on my technical team to say, yeah, that's nice, but I'm not going to use it because it's too thick. I can't feel anything. I can't hold the utensils or my surgical procedures well enough. So nice that you made it, but I'm never going to use it. Okay, so you need that technical expertise. You need to know the benefits outweigh the potential risk. And this is where the rubber meets the road, the review and the report. So we've done all this, we've sat down, and now we need to put it to paper. It's got to be factual and defendable. So us saying, well, we think it's going to be okay, is not defendable. It may be factual. We may have a feeling, but it's not defendable. And then we approve the report. Okay, so that's where most companies fail, is I don't have a report, we don't all agree, and I don't have anything that's documented. And then we do this all over again. And we continue to do this because now we're getting feedback. So we're getting feedback from internal audits as we're making the product, from CAPAs, which are corrective and preventive actions that we needed to put in, from complaints, from customer, users, manufacturing personnel, non-conforming. Didn't work. Like, we made the glove, but the silver's coming off. Well, that's not a conforming product. I don't want silver in my patients. I don't want silver in the user. So we take all of those and we dump them back into risk analysis and say, why did it fail? And were our assumptions right in the beginning? And if they're not, great. We're going back. We're going to do another risk analysis. We're going to fix it. So we call this a living, breathing document. You're continuously doing this and you're continuously writing it down. And I have seen risk analysis documents that are into, a couple of hundred versions. So by the time I've submitted to the regulator, I'm at a version like 155 because I've done so many changes. I've done so many risk analyses right from the conception of that product right through to the time I'm ready to submit it to the regulator. They've seen everything. They have seen all my thought process. They've seen the whole diary of that conception and that quality built in. Because as I'm evaluating this, I'm putting numbers to it. And as I put numbers to it, I increase the quality of this product. Okay, documentation. Got a few minutes. So documentation is procedures or instructions. Those are the rules, okay? You will have lots of them. You will have, anywhere from, I'd say, a couple of hundred documents, procedures to a couple of thousand, depending on the company. Records. These are what you wrote down, not the instructions, but how you actually fulfilled those instructions. So created, received, and maintained by an organization. What happens is I don't get these. I don't get the records. It's in somebody's head. Nobody likes writing it down. It takes too much time. And so I don't see this. And frankly, in a regulated environment, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. And you can't recreate it. So the documentation defines the scopes and rules of the element. It requires a review and approval. So I get a lot of documents that don't mean anything. And then it has to become effective. And then with the records, they have to be factual. So if I come from the quality background, if you ask me to backdate something, a document, I literally feel sick. Because I am so ingrained, that's not factual. That's actually committing fraud. So when somebody says to me, okay, we did this report like a year ago, but we didn't sign it. Can we sign it as last year? No. You can sign it as today and say that it was, you know, that you created it last year, but it was not signed. It was not legalized until today. And so they'll say, well, let's just sign it, you know, last year, because it makes it easier. There'll be no questions. Yeah, that's committing fraud. Okay, so it's factual. It's indelible. So a lot of times I see documents somebody can't find. If you've taken your cell phone and updated your contacts, how many contacts have you lost? Happens all the time. It happens with records, and then that they're retrievable. So these are the types of records. I'm not going to go through this laundry list of records, but you will have, and you should have started already, the design history file, a design risk management report, and started to do some of these if you've started to do prototypes. If you haven't done prototypes, then you've got these. Okay? You've already started to write the diary. Tell me how you conceived this, why you did all those who, what, when, why. And then as you develop this product, you will see these coming in. As I remember, I said the elements, quality elements come in and out. These elements will start to come in. So corrective and preventive actions, non-conforming. Again, a nice laundry list of things and records that you should have. So the key points for today and for designing in quality for your product is to ensure you keep that design control. Okay, so you're starting to document how you design this. You're starting to document a formal risk management. It doesn't have to be like 100 pages. Sometimes I get 1 page and that's all I need. You started, you wrote it down, you gave me the risk, and then you built upon it. And that's what I would expect. So you started to document it. You started to bring experts in. You didn't have information, so you started gathering that information, whether it mean you gathered it yourself, you gathered it from papers, you gathered it from talking to technical experts. And then document and records. So I call it record, record, record. I want the diary. I want the product diary, because that tells me that the quality has been built into that product. And frankly, when I get to a regulatory submission, I got everything, and it's wonderful. I can tell the story. The story makes sense and it builds, as opposed to, well, we kind of have a story, but we don't have a beginning and we don't have an end, but we do have the middle, because the end we don't know yet, but the middle, and we don't know where we came from. And the other thing is, if you take this technology and want to sell it, the worst thing is I go in and they ask me to do a due diligence on a company that they want to buy the technology, and they say to me, so Marion, do we have enough to file? And I say, we have a big 0 to file, because there's no design history file. There's no risk management documentation. I frankly don't know why they even created this. So I've got nothing. I can't tell any story. And chances are there's 1 person or 2 people who are left who are trying to sell this, and they have no background information, and I have no documentation. So you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So frankly, it's a great product, but I can't do anything with it. I can't defend this. So you definitely want to document. There is no such thing as too many documents. And there's no such thing as, you know, the diary referencing something. So yeah, we had our conceptual paper. We had our business plan, and there it defines blah, 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 blah. Great, I don't need it rewritten. I just need it documented. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Sorry, I'm just gonna look. No questions. Okay, yes?
How do you suggest documenting stuff, like, just in a way that would be defendable? Like, does it have to be like physical? Like, you know, you were talking about sign and stuff, or like.
Yeah, so it has to be defendable. So it has to be real time. So if you're using electronic means, so I need some kind of a signature. So I need basically to be defendable, it's signed and dated, and I can actually find the signature. So in a lot of companies, when we start companies, the first thing that person comes in, first day in the office, they sign a signature sheet. So I get their signature, I get their name, I get their initial. So anything they sign anywhere in the company, I know whose signature it is and the date. That's defendable. I don't care if it's on paper towels. I don't care if it's a Word document that's been printed. I don't care, you know, if it's a formal report, a template, whatever, as long as it's signed and dated. And then I keep it. That's defendable. That's a record. Okay? So like I said, all of a sudden this, you know, binder goes into 2 binders, which goes into 3 binders, which goes into 4 binders. And then you need a quality documentation system because you got to find all this stuff. But I can always sift through a lot of information and create the story than to sift, like, to have nothing. Like, this doesn't tell me anything. Lots of paper, I can figure out the story, and you can probably tell me the story a lot easier. Yeah, here's the conception paper. Here's the business plan. Here's the inputs. This is the users we needed to, this is what we needed for the outputs. Yes, any other questions? Did that answer your question? Yeah, okay. No? All right, well, thank you very much. If you have any, you know, questions or want some help, please.
Yeah, I'll be happy to share.
Yeah. And, you know, we can talk or email and, you know, help you through this process.
Thank you so much, Marianne. That was great.
Thank you.